Welcome back, Josh. You're a crowd favorite.
Ah, so kind of you. I would do anything at any time. Anytime you ask, Dana.
I love Ruthless. I love the Ruthless podcast. And what I really love is that you guys have been doing these hits with Will Cain's show.
Yeah. It's been fun. Getting all of us on a cable show, we have some ingenuity amongst ourselves to make sure that it's TV friendly. But no, Will is a good friend that we've known for a long time. And like you, Dana, anytime they ask, happy to oblige.
Thank you. As I said, when you have a podcast, then you just you do each other's podcasts. So right. we appreciate it. But there's reason for it because you have something to say. I thought I would start off with you by talking about, I think a lot of people are wondering what is going on with tariffs, right? There was the market turmoil last week. There was kind of like the shock and awe of it. My sense from a communication standpoint is that there are a lot of people in the country who are entrepreneurs of small and medium-sized businesses that are in shock right now. They feel like they are pawns in the system, and there's not a lot of ways for them to get out of it if they were sourcing any materials from China, and a lot of them were, because we don't make them here yet. And the idea that they can just make them here is great in theory, but not in practice. And I don't know where all of this is going. Now we have maybe exemptions on electronics, but maybe not, et cetera. And I find myself, I study this stuff pretty carefully. I read a lot, but even I'm like, wait, where are we now? I'm having a hard time figuring out where did this plane land, or is it still in the air?
Yeah, no, it feels like it's very much still in the air, and every once in a while there's a touch and go, and the circumstances.
Oh my
change.
gosh, have you ever been on one of those? Have you ever been on a plane where they had to you were going to land and you didn't?
A little uneasy.
That happened to Peter and I in Spain. This is so many years ago, like maybe 2005 or 6, and we were just about to land in Santiago de Compostela, where they do the pilgrimage.
Yeah.
So we're about to land, and then all of a sudden it was like a sharp up, and I had an out-of-body experience for about 20 seconds.
You never like something super unpredictable at the end of a plane flight.
and also there was just no information. And in the first, I speak Spanish fairly well, but not in a panic. So remember how it's the first commentary the first directions from the pilot are in Spanish, and then they do it in English?
Oh my gosh, you're like, okay, so what's happening? What's happening? Well, look, I think that's a pretty good analogy to a lot of the things that we're seeing here on the economy over the last couple of weeks with President Trump's administration. I think I start from the premise that President Trump's not wrong in his analysis of where we have these barriers to entry with American products. The rest of the world has been pretty privileged over the last 50 years at being able to sell into the United States with, perpetuity. They can do sort of whatever it is that they want, assuming that we want to consume the goods or services that they're selling. And we, on the other hand, have a lot of barriers to entry. The next time you see a Ford driving around Paris, that'll be the first time. Mm-hmm. And so these things are happening across the world. The problem is that when you get in these big blanket solutions, and I think I understand what it is that he's trying to do in trying to provide
theory. Mm-hmm.
Trying to provide some leverage for these larger negotiations and get a better deal for American workers and American taxpayers. I understand that. Problem is the global economy is super dynamic, and the one thing that it relies on more than anything else is consistency, because people need to plan. And you mentioned all the small business owners need to inventory certain parts that aren't available in the United States. And all of those things are going on sort of throughout the course of a calendar year. And anytime there's a big disruption of that, there's a disruption in the markets. There's a disruption in, how Wall Street and everybody else sees the economy and its growth. And I think it's one of those ironic twists where one of the great intangibles that President Trump has had in foreign policy and in some domestic policy as well, is he's fairly unpredictable, and it gives him leverage to do a whole bunch of things to try to make deals, and he loves to make deals. But in this case, unpredictability is tough. Global economy depends on it. And so that's where this thing is running into, headlong into the winds of people having a lot of concern over it. But I think as they go, it seems like day to day, they're making little tweaks and little changes where markets are responding. So in the end, I don't know where it goes in terms of what the final policy is. I do know that the negotiation piece with foreign countries is important. And it's also really important that we get some tax stability, which, of course, the House
Yes,
and
I
Senate
wanted to
are
ask
working
you
on.
about that, because if you think of the president's economic plan, there's like 3 legs to the stool. One of them is tariffs. One of them is taxes, because the Trump tax cuts run out, but maybe not, probably not. And then the third one is the deregulation. So the taxes part does give people certainty to plan, at least on that front. And I have been impressed with Senator Thune and Speaker Johnson, who have narrow margins in both the House and the Senate in order to get this agenda passed. And they've been able to get it. They are advancing down the field.
Yeah, no question. I think it's one of the most underrated components of the first 100 days is just how well they've been able to process these things. I mean, the majorities, particularly in the House, are just razor thin. And of course, you got a ton of personalities there too. And trying to corral all of that is, even when you have a decent sized majority, a difficult task to do. But I think Speaker Johnson's done an absolutely incredible job on that. And in the Senate, it seems like Senator Thune, Majority Leader Thune, has got his conference in a really good place where they're just sort of processing everything from the confirmation hearings and confirmation votes of the first month now through the larger part of this agenda. It's sort of line it up and knock it down, which is exactly what you want to see if you're in the Trump administration.
One of the things you posted last week on X was something I thought was worthwhile revisiting here. And it was when there were maybe a dozen House Republicans who were feeling like they didn't want to vote for the budget bill. And one of the things you said was like, but 73 million people didn't vote for you. They voted for the president. You might not like these particular things, but you need to vote as a team. Could you expand on that for people?
Yeah, it's also it doesn't work like state budgets do. State budgets, you have just this hardened budgetary process that you have to live within, and the appropriations process when people actually get paid the money that goes allocated by state legislatures. The budget on a federal side of things, unless you have the president, the House, and the Senate all controlled by one party, oftentimes they don't even pass a budget. I mean, this is not something that's signed into law by the President of the United States. The much more important process is the authorization of what you're going to do from a policy perspective and the appropriations, which actually spend all of the money. So the budget in and of itself is just a tool that a majority party uses to get into this larger discussion, in particular with taxes, which makes it something you can vote for on just simple majority in the Senate rather than having to risk the filibuster. And so the way I've seen that, it's the ultimate shirts and skins exercise, Dana. This is, if your team is writing the budget, you got to be on that team, because if you don't pass it, we don't even get to a discussion about the Trump tax cuts or anything else. And so, yeah, I see it as like an absolute no-brainer. And you can talk about all the things that you value. And obviously, deficit reduction is a huge component to what conservatives believe and want to have happen. But the budget is not the place where you're going to reform entitlements and make this massive change to spending, things that we see Doge working on a separate track.
There's also the fact that for any president, the problems of the world land on your desk and they continue on. And one of them is the Russia-Ukraine war. We saw a horrible attack, disgusting, horrible attack by the Russians against some Christians over the weekend, 34 killed. And that the terror that those people feel in Ukraine continues. The president said he could solve it in 24 hours. Obviously, that's a little tongue-in-cheek. But it seems to me that Putin is saying, I'm not really bothered about what the president is saying. And I imagine that Trump might ratchet up the pressure there pretty soon.
I would think. I mean, look, this is a super complicated problem, one that was made more complicated, obviously, day by day as that war has escalated for now, 3 years? A really, really significant problem that it's not necessarily intractable, but it's going to require an awful lot of negotiation. I happen to agree with President Trump that had he been president, I think the likelihood of Russia invading Ukraine was, non-existent. But given the whole vacuum that happened in our Afghanistan retreat under the Biden administration, it opened up a lot of opportunity for people who, see the world very, very differently than most people in the United States. And that includes Vladimir Putin, who thought, well, you're not going to do anything about it anyway, so I'm going to go take what I think is mine. But now that we're in this situation, obviously we saw the big blow up with the meeting. and just these negotiations that don't seem like they've actually gotten to the end point. I do think they're making progress, and I do think that it's something that they're focused on. But again, you got all these other problems in the world, right? I mean, we've been talking about China with the tariffs. We're talking about Iran with the development of nuclear weapons and all of that.
And we still have hostages being held in Gaza.
It still have hostages in Gaza. And oh, by the way, Iran funding Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas. And so all of these things are sort of intertwined, although they're separate. And we're working on all of them. You can see the Trump administration, almost every day has news on one piece or another. Yeah. But I don't think this is a 24-hour experience.
Over the weekend, as I was getting prepared for this, I was thinking about a conversation that you and I were in. This is before I came to Fox full time, and I was in. It would have been in 2009. There was a meeting where a bunch of Republicans, conservatives get together and they're talking about things. And I remember you were there. Stephen Law was there, a few others. And we were all talking about the importance of the Supreme Court and possible vacancies coming forward. And there was a big article in one of the, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, had a big roundup of all of these cases that are about to be in front of the Supreme Court based on President Trump's actions over the last 4 months. And it makes sense, right? They've moved fast. They've broken things. They've had, I would say, done pretty well so far in the courts in getting rulings being favorable to them. Doesn't mean they're always going to win. But before we end this segment, I thought maybe give you a chance to talk about thinking back on that time from 2009 till when? Till Amy Coney Barrett, just like how important those Supreme Court fights were at the time.
I mean, incredibly important. I mean, I had dedicated a huge portion of my former life to this very topic, in large part because then Leader McConnell viewed it as the one lasting legacy that any sort of Republican majority could accomplish with a Republican president of the United States. And understanding that, tax policy or spending policy or all these things are only as durable as the next election. You can change it every time. But when you're putting lifetime appointment Supreme Court justices in there, you're fundamentally reshaping the way the highest court in the land ultimately lands on these big thorny questions. And the left has done just an incredible job. And I say that not as an admirer of it, but they've done an incredible job of installing judges throughout, 25, 30 years that see themselves as legislators in robes. And they want outcomes rather than sort of understanding the law and how the Constitution applies. And so the counter battle the conservatives have had, and the Trump administration did a terrific job, along with Leader McConnell in the first 4 years, was getting these strict constructionist judges in there that are going to interpret the law, apply the constitutionality of it, and ultimately rule, which is their job. And it doesn't seem like that, which should be such a difficult proposition for everybody to understand, but it has been. And now you're seeing massive repercussions to the good work that have been done by having conservatives basically being able to get good policy, not be challenged and thrown out by really, really bad judges.
And it drives the left crazy. I wanted to ask you about something that happened last week with Governor Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan. Now, she is a Democrat. She is a big personality. Apparently, she's kind of a kick to be around. She's like fun, and people quite like her. They call her. She thinks it's funny that people call her Big Gretch. She's a tall woman, pretty lady. And she went to the Oval Office last week to thank the president for working on this Asian carp issue. And he called in the press, and then he had a big press conference. Anyway, so she gets caught in the Oval Office, and she immediately comes under the most horrendous, I thought it was horrendous pressure from the left saying, how dare you?
Yeah.
And I'm like, but she is a governor, guys. Like, what do you expect her to do?
It's true. And I think the left has hamstrung Democrats in the most horrible way over the last couple of years. And they expect this far left progressive dogma, no matter what, from every single person who has a Democrat affiliation whatsoever. But you've seen people like Gretchen Whitmer or Gavin Newsom out in California understand that their party is in a very bad place. And ultimately, the majority-making coalition for Democrats resides somewhere in the middle, as it did with President Trump. And you're going to have to persuade people that not only are you looking out for their best interest, but you're willing to talk to anybody in the process. Well, the left can't have it, right? They just don't want that discussion whatsoever. They just want this dogmatic pursuit an obstructionist agenda that, you hear him like swearing every 5 minutes, that this is somehow they're showing the left how
it's like
tough.
When they hear, we want someone who fights for us. Okay, well, if I say the F word, will that do it? And apparently not. Even that is not enough.
Does. I mean, they hope it does, honestly. But that's part and parcel of the larger problem that we've seen with the Democratic Party in recent years, that it's all theater. It's all act. It's all a play. I mean, nobody can actually tell you what it is that they stand for other than the things that were defined throughout the course of the last election. Open borders, right? I mean, higher taxes, inflation.
Can I interrupt and ask you about Bernie Sanders? He's been doing these rallies around the country, and he's brought Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with him. So, there's the contrast of the older Democrat and the young firebrand. And they got 36,000 people to show up in Los Angeles. Now, I asked someone else about this last week, not on the podcast, and they said throughout his life, Bernie Sanders could always find that type of crowd. Like there's always going to be a certain amount of fringe on the left that will show up. So is that it, or is there some energy there that Republicans should pay attention to?
Well, I do think there is energy, but I do think is that same sort of niche demo that gets you to 20, maybe 20% of the electorate that is just this hardcore progressive Democrat. That exists. I mean, that exists throughout our country. And I think there is something to be said about authenticity and intellectual honesty, which is something that they have. They will tell you exactly what they believe. I mean, he's a democratic socialist. He says that.
Yep. Right. Proudly.
Whereas the rest of them will basically pay lip service to that and then govern as a democratic socialist, but ultimately, in fact, like tariffs are actually quite a left-wing thing. It is.
And Gretchen Whitmer is like, I'm with him on tariffs, but I don't want to say it.
Yeah, exactly. So they're stuck in this intellectual dishonesty that the American people have been able to see through. And I think in recent years with things like this podcast or alternative sources of media, you're seeing a need from voters for anybody seeking public office to have some level of authenticity. One of the reasons why President Trump is so popular. They have none of it. I mean, it really is like AOC, you can think maybe Jasmine Crockett, Bernie Sanders, and the far left. This whole center are people like Gretchen Whitmer who are trying to figure out how they can be a reasonable individual and still capture some of that energy and authenticity that the Bernie crowd has. I think it's a mutually exclusive deal. I really do. I just don't think that they want to hear anything reasonable at this point. And that's where the energy is within the Democratic Party. It's causing them a lot of problems.
One other thing I wanted to mention here is that there was a terrible arson attack on Governor Josh Shapiro's home and at the governor's mansion. He and his family were asleep. Thankfully, they got out okay. This is a terrible situation. There is a suspect who has been arrested. The damage inside the mansion is terrible. When you see,
totally,
it's kind of hard to imagine. Like, where were the police? Where was the security? How does somebody get in and do all of this? I guess those answers are to come in time. I don't know if there's really any commentary except for to say, like, I'm sorry that it happened and I'm glad he's okay and I'm glad that they caught somebody they think did it.
Yeah, I mean, look, absolutely awful. And I think now we've seen the multiple assassination attempts on President Trump. You see this with Governor Shapiro's residence. I mean, we're at a point in time here where there are crazy people out there. And we're going to have to come to grips with this self-radicalization that's happening amongst very, very few. But it exists. And security needs to be reexamined across the board. And for a public figure, Shapiro became a national household name during the vice presidential search, which ultimately came up short to then Governor Walz. And so he's a public figure of some recognition. And here you got a crazy person who wants to do something about that. It's terrible. Mm-hmm. And I think as a society, we need to revisit an awful lot of this to ensure that we don't have this sort of political violence going forward. And
at the very least, make sure that our elected officials have the security that they need to protect them and their families. Indeed. Yeah. Josh, what are you paying attention to right now that is on your radar, might not be on mine?
I think that the one piece that is on my radar that won't be on anybody else's radar, but something that I've struggled with for 10 years, is we're having these discussions about trade deficits. We're having the discussions about tax policy. But the sort of reformatting of what would make America completely boom as an economy for generations to come, in my view, is being missed, right? Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and interest on our national debt are now above 70% of our national debt. And that means we're in the 20s now about what your legislators that you send to Washington actually vote on. And I don't know how many people actually know that. But each day it gets worse. I mean, I remember doing this, Dana, when you were in the White House and I was on Capitol Hill, that number was like 50.
I know.
And it
remember that pie chart? And you would just be like, oh.
Oh, and it just...
and now the pie chart's so much worse.
It's so much worse, but it was also very predictable even at the time. And there were a couple of efforts that happened in the 2010s that were trying to address that. But until we, as a society, make an understanding that we're going to have to do something with the entitlement state, it is very difficult to just grow yourself out of that. We're having just these little like teardrop in the ocean type discussions, right? And that, it bothers me. I think at some point we're going to be forced to deal with it. It may not be in the next 4 years. It may not be, in the next 8, but it's coming. And it's probably within the next decade where we're going to have to make some really, really difficult decisions to try to get America's finances back under wraps.
We did a little exercise where we looked at, let's just, in fantasy land, imagine that President Bush's, I think, fairly modest changes to Social Security that was optional for people if they wanted to take a portion of their Social Security and invest it instead. It was something like, it was a crazy number of how much money people would actually have in their retirement savings if we had done it in 2005. That was when the Republicans were like, we're behind you, sir. Like, so far behind, they couldn't even be seen. They were so far in the distance. But I've always believed that when this issue gets solved, either by force or because we have the will to do it, it'll look something like that. That actually, what you say is actually along the lines of what I wanted to not necessarily answer on this podcast, but to just pose it and think about this over the next little while, because I'm curious what my listeners think and what you think, what my friends think. If America were an emergency room and we had triage, and you're the doctor, the emergency room doctor, what problem would you tackle first?
Well, I think the big thing is the cancer within you. It's this massive debt and this unsustainable balance sheet that gets worse each and every day. Now, there are a lot of things that we can do to improve the economy. I think we're having a very modest discussion, by the way, on the tax side. Like every time there's been a trifecta of Republican president, House, and Senate, you're talking about major rate cuts, corporate rate, individual, all these things that like fundamentally incentivize growth of the economy. We're basically talking about, extending the current policy, which is...
Or even raising taxes on the rich.
Right, which I can't even believe that there is a Republican that has discussions about raising marginal tax rates. Like, that's crazy. But part of that reason is because it's always been absolute third rail to talk about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. All of these systems that were created decades ago with a life expectancy that does not reflect where the country is now. And I think that's problematic. You got to have an honest discussion with the American people about where we're headed. Democrats have, since LBJ, really since FDR, but really since LBJ, have decided that they're going to take an incremental approach to expand eligibility for all of the major entitlements in this country. You create an entitlement for the old, an entitlement for the young, and then you keep expanding eligibility until it blocks out the sun and there's no private sector left. That's what they're doing.
Senator Hassan, a Democrat from New Hampshire, was on America's Newsroom this morning, worried about one particular program that deals with fentanyl, and it's a part of the Medicaid program. I'm like, I get it. But Medicaid has increased by 207% since 2008.
Right.
And do we think there's nowhere to cut?
Yeah.
And so I think that, I don't know exactly how I'd answer this question. It might change over time, but what you're saying is the solution in terms of the triage doctor is the root cause of a lot of other problems. The other one that's on my mind a lot is K through 12 education.
Yeah. I mean, education it's such a nagging problem, and I think you start with the K through 12 piece, which you've highlighted, that is a huge deal, and that we've had test scores that are not reflecting investment. And I think the Trump administration has diagnosed that absolutely right. You got to figure out how to get local control and responsibility. I mean, ultimately, people need to be responsible for the education of our kids in their communities and their states and move that forward. I also think that this extends into higher education. I mean, good Lord, you look at colleges and universities, what's been happening over the last few years, and it's unrecognizable from the America that most of us know.
Last week we did a story about Harvard having to teach remedial math.
Right.
And that actually irritated me so much.
It makes you furious, right?
This is embarrassing.
Yes, absolutely embarrassing. But also, look, we've had no real emphasis on trade schools and creating skill sets that can be applied, to people when they enter the workforce. I mean, this is sort of like remedial financial literacy. That would be a nice thing, right? I think somebody in their 20s would really enjoy having some understanding about how to manage your finances. And yet, we're often an English lit discussion where that's basically what, as a society in higher education, we have valued. That needs to change. And if President Trump is serious about bringing back manufacturing in any serious way to the United States, it starts with making sure that you've got a skill set and an emphasis of people coming out of high school and coming out of, whether it's trade schools or universities, with a skill set that can operate such a thing. Because it's not going to look like Youngstown, Ohio, 1950. I mean, we're talking about AI, automation. There's real skill sets and real opportunity for high-paying jobs in the next 10 years in this country, but we got to get that piece right.
All right. Josh Holmes, thank you for joining me again. Everyone, Dana, you can check him out on the Ruthless Podcast. He and his colleagues, it's informative, entertaining, and a lot of fun. So
thanks so much
for having me. I'll let you get back to your day.